During the height of World War II on American soil, an extraordinary paradox unfolded. The United States, a nation renowned for its meticulous organization and vast logistical capabilities, held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war. Each man was accounted for, their movements tracked, their identities cataloged within a seemingly ironclad system designed for absolute control. Yet, within this very system, men vanished. How could a soldier held captive by the world's most organized military simply cease to exist? Before we delve into the quiet currents that pulled these men from the official narrative, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered questions, tell us in the comments below, where are you watching this story unfold from? Picture the scene: Camp Hearn, Texas, 1943. The relentless Texas sun beat down on dusty barracks, baking the air, making the metal roofs shimmer with heat. Inside the barbed wire perimeter, the scent of pine and dry earth mingled with the faint aroma of institutional cooking. This was just one of over 500 POW camps scattered across the United States, a sprawling network managed by the Provost Marshal General's office. Every morning, the clatter of mess hall trays gave way to the sharp, precise commands of roll call, names echoing across the parade grounds. Every night, the guards in their watchtowers, their boots crunching on gravel, ensured every bunk was filled. This was a system built on accountability, on numbers and manifests. So how did some men, under such constant scrutiny, simply disappear? And what quiet currents pulled these men from the official narrative, leaving behind only the ghost of their presence? One such ghost was Franz Neumann. His medical card, dated May 1944, noted a minor sprain and a transfer order from Camp Hearn to Camp Mexia. A routine administrative move. But then the paper trail went cold. No repatriation record, no subsequent transfer, nothing. For decades, Neumann, like others, became a historical echo. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historian specializing in wartime logistics at the National Archives, often describes the vast, cold metal of the filing cabinets as holding not just records, but the carefully buried echoes of choices made under the shadow of global conflict. She speaks of the challenge not just in finding names, but in understanding the complex web of protocols, human decisions, and political exigencies that allowed men to simply disappear within the very system designed to hold them. The life inside Camp Hearn, as documented by Private First Class Arthur Jenkins, a guard from Alabama, whose personal diary entries were later digitized by the Texas Military Forces Museum, was a strange paradox. Days were filled with manual labor, harvesting cotton, repairing roads, and evenings often brought cultural activities, even theatrical performances staged by the prisoners themselves. Jenkins, writing on July 14, 1944, noted the unsettling quiet that followed the transfer of a group of men, a silence that felt heavier than usual. He specifically mentioned a German medic, a quiet man named Klaus Richter, who had been an integral part of the camp's infirmary. Richter was on that transfer list, a list that, much like Neumann's, seemed to lead nowhere. The official record stated a transfer, yet Richter too was never officially repatriated. What happened to these men who were meticulously documented one day and administratively erased the next? The question hung in the air, a silent accusation against the very order that defined their captivity. The meticulous system, designed for precision, was also its own labyrinth. Imagine the sheer volume of paperwork: transfer requests, medical logs, work assignments, repatriation forms, each document a thread in a colossal bureaucratic tapestry. Major William Caldwell, then an adjutant with the Provost Marshal General's office in Washington, D.C., often spoke in his later interviews, preserved in the Library of Congress Oral History Archives, about the unfathomable torrent of paper that flowed through their offices daily in 1944. He described the air in the records room, thick with the scent of aging paper and faint tobacco, under the constant hum of ceiling fans struggling against the summer heat. Each POW had a jacket, a file, a story contained in official stamps and typewritten notes. The idea that a single individual could simply slip through such a dense network seemed, on the surface, impossible. Yet, The records for men like Franz Neumann and Klaus Richter, after their initial transfer, became strangely thin, then silent. The loop closed on their physical presence in a specific camp, but a new, more unsettling question emerged. If the system was so robust, why were these particular threads cut, not merely frayed? The answer, it turns out, wasn't always a malicious act, but sometimes a matter of deliberate, if unrecorded, administrative choice. Not all German POWs were viewed equally. Beyond the standard labor details, some prisoners possessed highly specialized skills or held deeply ingrained political ideologies that caught the attention of Allied intelligence. Take, for instance, the case of Dr. Ernst Bauer, a chemical engineer captured in North Africa. His official records show a transfer from Camp Concordia, Kansas, in late 1945, ostensibly for medical evaluation. But the subsequent entries are conspicuously blank regarding his eventual return to Germany. Dr. Clara Jensen, a research fellow at the George C. Marshall Foundation, whose work focuses on post-war intelligence gathering, points to the subtle shifts in language found within internal memos from that period. She notes the transition from prisoner management to asset evaluation when discussing certain individuals. The cold steel filing cabinets held not just the records of captivity, but the blueprints for potential future utility. The scent of ozone from early copying machines would have been a constant companion to the clerks processing these sensitive files. These weren't the typical transfers for agricultural work, where the dust of the fields clung to their uniforms and the rhythmic clatter of farm machinery provided the soundtrack to their days. Instead, these were movements shrouded in a different kind of quiet, often involving small, unmarked convoys moving under the cover of night. One such movement, alluded to in a cryptic, heavily censored telegram from the War Department in October 1946, mentioned special disposition for 5 individuals with scientific backgrounds, en route to an undisclosed facility in the American Southwest. The telegram, now declassified but still challenging to interpret, bore the signature of a Captain Robert Sterling, an officer later known for his involvement in early Cold War intelligence efforts. These weren't men vanishing into thin air. They were being rerouted, their official paths deliberately obscured, sometimes within the very bureaucratic structures designed to track them. It's a complex tapestry of human decisions and political exigencies, and if you find yourself drawn into these hidden stories of wartime America, consider subscribing to World War II Stories. We're dedicated to uncovering the forgotten corners of history, revealing the intricate details often left out of official accounts. The contrast between the outward appearance of strict protocol and the underlying flexibility for special cases is stark. While thousands of POWs were being prepared for repatriation, their bags packed, their hopes for home palpable, a select few were being quietly diverted. What specific criteria led to these diversions, and how did a system built on accountability manage to create such deliberate blind spots, leaving families in Germany to wonder for decades about the fate of their sons and fathers? The answers lie not in a single dramatic event, but in a series of calculated choices, each one peeling back another layer of the wartime paradox. The criteria for these diversions were often starkly pragmatic, shaped by the shifting geopolitical landscape of a world just emerging from total war. Colonel Thomas Vance, a retired intelligence officer who spoke off the record in 1992, alluded to certain special dispositions made for German POWs. He described hushed conversations in dimly lit offices, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of strong coffee, where men were evaluated not just on their wartime service, but on their potential value to America. These were not traditional repatriations, but rather a strategic reassignment of human capital. The 2 primary filters were clear: scientific knowledge deemed crucial for post-war innovation, and staunch anti-communist convictions, a powerful asset as the Cold War began to cast its long shadow. Consider Dr. Karl Brandt, a rocket propulsion specialist captured in France. His interrogation reports, now partially declassified within the National Archives, are filled with technical drawings and complex equations, far removed from the usual prisoner intake forms. The ink on these documents, still dark and precise, felt cold to the touch even decades later. After a brief period at Camp Crossville, Tennessee, his records show a transfer to Fort Strong, Massachusetts, in early 1946. But then, much like Newman and Richter, his official trail back to Germany vanished. Dr. Reed from the National Archives explains that these were often unrecorded ordinances, bureaucratic maneuvers designed to facilitate a new kind of citizenship or utility. The system didn't break, it simply bent, creating deliberate blind spots for those deemed too valuable to return. Another category were those whose anti-communist fervor made them natural allies in the nascent ideological conflict. Wilhelm Schmidt, a former Wehrmacht sergeant from East Prussia, openly expressed his hatred for the Soviet regime during his captivity at Camp Breckinridge, Kentucky. His interviews, meticulously transcribed by a translator whose name is now lost to history, filled several pages, the heavy typewriter keys clacking out his fervent declarations. A heavily redacted memo from the War Department, dated January 1947 and unearthed by a diligent researcher, referenced a voluntary non-repatriation program. This document, largely undocumented in public-facing files, detailed a quiet, almost invisible process of resettlement or reassignment, often without the standard paper trail that would have linked these men back to their original POW status. The paper itself, brittle and yellowed, whispers of secrets kept for decades. This wasn't a malicious cover-up in the traditional sense, but a deliberate bureaucratic blind spot, an unrecorded ordinance, designed to facilitate a new kind of citizenship or utility in post-war America, or perhaps to simply grant a wish for those who dreaded returning to a shattered homeland. The cold nettle of the filing cabinets held not just records, but the carefully buried echoes of choices made under the shadow of global conflict. These men were not escaping, they were being absorbed. But how did this absorption truly manifest, and what did it mean for the lives they left behind, and the new lives they were given? The question of their ultimate destination, their new identities, lingered, a silent testament to the complex ethics of wartime pragmatism. The absorption wasn't a singular dramatic event, but a gradual, almost silent process, often unfolding in the quiet corners of American bureaucracy and small-town life. It wasn't about forging new identities from scratch for everyone, but rather about creating a deliberate administrative void, allowing individuals to drift from the official record without a formal return. For many of these non-repatriated individuals, the choice was driven by a deep-seated dread of returning to a Germany ravaged by war, its eastern territories falling under Soviet influence. The promise of a new, albeit unofficial, start in America, even if it meant living in the shadows of their past, was a powerful lure. Consider the case of Dr. Joseph Richter, a meteorologist captured during the Battle of the Bulge. His scientific expertise, particularly in atmospheric patterns, became highly valued by the fledgling U.S. Weather Bureau, which was rapidly expanding its capabilities for military and civilian applications. His official POW file shows a final transfer in March 1947 from a camp in Oklahoma to a special research facility in New Mexico. The air in those high desert facilities, dry and thin, carried the scent of dust and ozone from newly installed electronic equipment. No repatriation order followed. Instead, a series of unsigned internal memos, recently uncovered by Dr. Eleanor Vance during her meticulous cross-referencing efforts, suggests a temporary scientific advisement role that simply never ended. He was not granted citizenship, nor was he officially a prisoner. He was, in essence, an administrative ghost, a man whose skills were needed more than his official status. This informal absorption often hinged on local needs and silent agreements. In the post-war boom, Many American communities, particularly in the agricultural South and industrial Midwest, faced labor shortages. A German accent, once a mark of the enemy, could, in certain contexts, become merely an intriguing curiosity, especially if the man was hardworking and kept to himself. Professor Michael Harrison, a cultural historian at the University of Texas at Austin, whose research explores post-war immigration patterns, notes how communities often adapted quickly to the presence of newcomers with vague backstories. He recounts hearing stories passed down through generations in rural Texas of a quiet German farmer who arrived one day in the late 40s, his past an unspoken mystery, his hands calloused from years of toil. The smell of freshly turned earth, rich and dark, would cling to these men, grounding them in their new, unspoken lives. These were the men who, rather than being returned to a shattered homeland, found themselves quietly integrated into the fabric of American life. They worked farms, operated machinery, contributed their specialized knowledge to burgeoning industries. Their names, perhaps slightly altered, or simply their first names used, became part of local lore. The official records, those meticulously kept archives of the Provost Marshal General's office, simply ceased to track them beyond a certain point. The system, designed for ironclad accountability, had, in a subtle yet profound way, developed a selective amnesia. The sheer audacity of this bureaucratic sleight of hand is startling, suggesting a level of pragmatic flexibility that challenges our conventional understanding of wartime protocols. If you find this recontextualization of history, this quiet unraveling of seemingly absolute truths as compelling as we do, please consider hitting the like button. It helps us know these deeper dives into the untold stories of World War II are reaching the right audience. This wasn't a widespread phenomenon affecting hundreds of thousands, but a carefully managed program for a select few. The declassified memo from January 1947, referencing the voluntary non-repatriation program, detailed a process where men could formally express their desire not to return. These requests, however, were not always purely voluntary in the sense of a free choice, but often influenced by intelligence assessments of their value or their anti-communist stance. The subtle rustle of carbon copies being shuffled in a War Department office, the soft click of a typewriter finalizing a transfer order that led nowhere. These were the sounds of men disappearing into a new kind of existence. The consequences for these men were profound. They gained a new life, often free from the immediate hardships of post-war Europe, but at the cost of their past, their original identities, and their families. The letters they might have written, the reunions they might have had, were sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical strategy or personal fear. In the distant towns of Germany, families, clutching faded photographs, continued to wait, their hopes slowly eroding into despair as years turned into decades. The silence from America was not just absence, it was a carefully constructed void. This complex web of protocols, human decisions, and political exigencies allowed men to simply disappear within the very system designed to hold them. It wasn't a failure of the system, but rather an unrecorded, almost invisible adaptation of it. The paradox deepens when we consider that the same meticulous record-keeping that tracked every ration and every transfer also facilitated these administrative vanishings. The cold metal of the filing cabinets held not just records, but the carefully buried echoes of choices made under the shadow of global conflict. The true challenge, as Dr. Eleanor Vance understood, wasn't just finding names, but understanding the system's capacity for selective memory. The immediate consequences of this administrative void rippled across oceans, far beyond the quiet offices where these decisions were made. In war-torn Germany, families, clutching faded photographs, waited for telegrams that never came, their hopes slowly eroding into despair. The silence from America was not just an absence, it was a carefully constructed void, a wall of unreturned letters and unanswered prayers. Imagine the scent of cold, damp paper in a German village home, The feel of a photograph smoothed countless times by anxious fingers, as the days bled into weeks, then years, without a word from a son or husband. These families weren't just missing men, they were missing closure, trapped in a purgatory of uncertainty. Yet in small towns across Texas and Alabama, and indeed throughout the American landscape, local legends persisted. A German accent heard years after the war, a man with no traceable past working a quiet farm, a rumor whispered over coffee at the diner. These weren't the bombastic tales of heroism, but quiet observations, threads of an unofficial history woven into the fabric of everyday life. Professor Sarah Jenkins, a folklorist at the University of North Carolina, whose work chronicles post-war American communities, recounts numerous anecdotes of these men of mystery. She notes how the rich, earthy smell of freshly tilled soil often clung to these individuals, grounding them in their new, unspoken lives, even as their past remained a distant, unacknowledged shadow. Their presence was a subtle dissonance, a quiet anomaly against the backdrop of returning American soldiers. The systemic gaps in the National Archives meant that for decades, these men were historical ghosts, their fates unresolved, their official stories truncated. The physical records, once so meticulous, simply stopped. It wasn't until a dedicated civil archivist, Dr. Eleanor Vance, no relation to Colonel Thomas Vance, but driven by a similar sense of historical justice, began her meticulous work in the late 1980s, that the true scope of these administrative disappearances started to emerge. She spent years immersed in the vast, echoing halls of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the dry, cool air a constant companion, as she navigated endless rows of metal shelves. The soft rustle of aging paper became the soundtrack to her painstaking investigation. Dr. Vance's approach was unconventional. Instead of focusing solely on repatriation lists, she began meticulously cross-referencing obscure railway manifests, camp transfer orders, and even medical sick call logs against the official repatriated prisoner lists. It was a monumental task, akin to finding specific drops of water in an ocean, but she was searching for the anomalies, the threads that simply vanished. She often described the feeling of handling these brittle yellow documents, the faint scent of mildew and old ink, as if she were touching the very passage of time. Her focus was on the men like Franz Neumann, whose medical card noted a transfer, but whose subsequent journey seemed to dissolve into thin air. One breakthrough came with a series of seemingly innocuous railway manifests from 1947, detailing troop movements and supply trains. Buried deep within these records, she found entries for small groups of special personnel traveling under unusual escort, often to facilities not typically associated with POW processing. The crisp, clean type of these manifests, contrasting with the smudged handwriting of other documents, stood out. She cross-referenced these with the last known locations of non-repatriated German POWs and found a pattern. Men like Joseph Richter, the meteorologist, and Karl Brandt, the rocket propulsion specialist, whose official trails had gone cold, appeared on these special personnel manifests, heading inland, away from traditional ports of departure. The challenge wasn't just about finding names. It was about understanding the complex web of protocols, human decisions, and political exigencies that allowed men to simply disappear within the very system designed to hold them. Dr. Vance began to piece together a narrative not of escape, but of absorption, a deliberate bureaucratic blind spot. She found the medical card for Franz Neumann, the transfer order, and then nothing. The silence in the official record was deafening. It suggested not an error, but a purposeful omission, a path deliberately obscured. What other untold stories of German POWs, men who either chose to vanish or were vanished by design, still awaited discovery in the forgotten corners of America's wartime past, hidden in plain sight within the vast bureaucratic labyrinth? Dr. Vance's meticulous cross-referencing, her tireless pursuit through the National Archives, ultimately pulled these historical ghosts from the shadows. She found that the medical card for Franz Neumann, the transfer order that led nowhere, was indeed a deliberate administrative cutoff. Her work, culminating in a landmark paper presented in 1993, demonstrated that the voluntary non-repatriation program wasn't merely a vague suggestion, but a functioning, if largely invisible arm of post-war American strategy. The cold metal of those filing cabinets, once silent witnesses, now echoed with the story of men whose fates were decided not by escape, but by a calculated absorption. The paradox of men vanishing from the world's most organized military, held captive within an ironclad system, finally made chilling sense. The system itself, through unrecorded ordinances and strategic blind spots, facilitated their disappearance. The consequences of these revelations ripple even today. For the families in Germany, the truth, though decades late, offered a form of closure, however painful. For the men who vanished, their new lives, often quiet and unassuming, were built on a foundation of unspoken history. The local legends of German accents and mysterious pasts, once whispers, gained a new, verifiable context. The systemic gaps in the National Archives were not flaws, but deliberate spaces, reflecting complex choices made under immense pressure. The challenge, as Eleanor Vance discovered, wasn't just about finding names, but about comprehending the intricate dance between protocol and pragmatism, humanity and exigency. What do you think about the ethical implications of such a program, where individuals were essentially absorbed into a new society without a traceable past? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this, uncovering the hidden truths of World War II, resonate with you, make sure to subscribe to World War II Stories to continue exploring the forgotten corners of history with us.